Chapter 1: The Quiet Season. Harold Benton had long since stopped setting his alarm, though he woke at 5:30 every morning just the same. Old habits die hard, and the body keeps its own clock long after the world stops asking it to. For 40 years, the Millersville post office had counted on Harold to be the first one in, the man who switched on the sorting lights and started the coffee. Now, there was no mailbag to shoulder, no truck to load, just the gentle creak of his apartment floorboards and the hiss of the coffee pot as the morning brewed itself into being. Outside his window, a single maple tree stood on the small lawn behind the senior apartments. Most of its leaves had turned a fiery red by early October, and Harold took quiet pleasure in watching the squirrels race through its branches as though the season would never end. The sky beyond it was the soft gray of newspaper print, and somewhere down by the river, a freight train moaned its low, mournful whistle. He liked the sound. It reminded him that the world kept moving. After breakfast, Harold opened the Millersville Gazette, folded it neatly, and read the front page. Then he turned, reluctantly, to the obituaries. He told himself he wasn't looking for anyone in particular, but the names mattered: the old neighbors, the retired teachers, the people he'd once passed every Sunday at church. When he saw one he knew, he took off his reading glasses and stared for a while, whispering, "Goodbye, old friend," before turning the page. It was his own quiet ritual. That morning, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the thinning light of autumn or the ache in his knees that told him rain was coming. Or maybe it was because he'd found, tucked in the back of his desk drawer, a photograph he hadn't seen in years, a faded picture of a woman standing by a fence, smiling shyly at the camera. Clara Whitmore, 1971. He ran his thumb over the corner of the photo. She had been his friend once, a good one. Maybe more, if life had turned a little differently. But it hadn't. It almost never does. He made another cup of coffee and sat by the window, the picture beside him on the table. The maple tree shimmered with the morning wind, and he found himself whispering her name under his breath. "Clara," he said softly, and the name felt strange on his tongue after so many years. The rhythm of the days. The apartment complex was called Riverside Haven, though Harold sometimes joked that the Haven part depended on whether the laundry machines were working that week. Still, it was a nice enough place. The manager, Denise, was a cheerful woman in her 40s who always called the residents "my darlings." And the other tenants were mostly widows who baked too many muffins and loved to talk about grandchildren. Harold fit in just fine. He kept to himself, played cribbage with the guys in the lounge on Wednesdays, and tended the community garden out back. His tomatoes were small but determined, like him. He didn't mind the quiet most days. But now and then, when the evening light slanted across his kitchen table, he'd feel something stir inside him, something that asked, "What have you done with all your years, Harold Benton? And what are you waiting for now?" He didn't have an answer. That question followed him through the weeks until one chilly afternoon, when a letter arrived in his mailbox. A real letter, not a bill or advertisement, with a return address he didn't recognize. M. Whitmore, St. Louis, Missouri. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The letter: "Dear Mr. Benton, I hope you don't mind my writing out of the blue. My name is Margaret Whitmore. You may have known my mother, Clara. She passed away earlier this summer. While sorting through her things, I found your name on an old letter tucked inside a poetry book. She'd written on the envelope, 'Someone who understood kindness.' There wasn't a letter inside, just your name. I thought you might want to know she spoke of Millersville often. With warm regards, Margaret Whitmore." Harold stared at the paper for a long time. The words blurred, then cleared again. He set the letter down, stood, and walked slowly to the window. The maple tree was bare now, its branches thin and black against the late afternoon sky. He remembered that poetry book, how they'd both loved the same line from Frost: "The best way out is always through." He remembered her laughter at the fire hall dance, her hand brushing his sleeve when when she said goodbye after his service in '69. He remembered the letter he'd written her once and never sent, still sealed in a drawer somewhere back home. He thought he'd forgotten her. Turns out, he'd just been holding his breath all these years. An unexpected visit. 2 weeks later, Margaret came to Millersville. Harold met her at the local diner, the same one that had been serving pancakes since he was a boy. She looked to be in her 40s, with the same soft brown eyes as her mother. When she smiled, Harold felt a pinch in his chest, a memory flickering back to life. "I just wanted to see the town she talked about," she said. "She always said Millersville had the kindest people." "She was one of them," Harold said quietly. They talked for over an hour. She asked about the post office, about the river, about what her mother had been like when she was young. Harold told her stories, about Clara volunteering at the church picnic, about the dance at the fire hall, about the way she laughed even when times were hard. He kept some memories to himself, of course, the private kind that belonged only to him and to the years gone by. When they said goodbye, Margaret took his hand. "I'm glad she had a friend like you," she said. "She must have thought of you often." Harold didn't know what to say. He just nodded, his throat tight. As he walked home through the crisp autumn air, he realized that the ache he'd carried for so long wasn't about lost love anymore. It was about unfinished words, the kind that linger between two people, unspoken but real. Evening reflections. That night, Harold sat by the window again. The maple tree stood dark against the streetlight, its few remaining leaves fluttering like whispers. He thought about all the letters he'd sorted over the years, thousands, maybe millions. All those words crossing towns, states, lifetimes. People saying what they needed to say. Except him. He opened his desk drawer, found a blank sheet of stationery, and began to write. Not to Clara this time, but to Margaret. "Dear Margaret, thank you for writing to me. Your mother was one of the finest people I ever knew. She had a way of making the ordinary seem special. Please know she left kindness wherever she went, and it hasn't faded yet. Yours sincerely, Harold Benton." He folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and smiled to himself. The old postman in him still believed in delivering words that mattered. Outside, the street lamp's glow shimmered softly through the window pane, and Harold whispered, "Sleep well, Clara." Chapter 2. The Letter in Lavender. The first snow of the season came earlier than anyone expected. By Thanksgiving, Millersville looked like a postcard. White roofs, frozen lawns, and a ribbon of smoke rising from nearly every chimney in town. Harold Benton watched it all from his window, a mug of cocoa in his hands and a blanket around his legs. The maple tree outside was now bare, its branches etched black against the pale sky. The world seemed both peaceful and lonely, the way it often does in late November. On the table beside him sat a box he hadn't opened in years, a small cedar chest that once belonged to his wife, Ellen. He'd brought it out to find an old photograph for Margaret Whitmore, but as he sifted through the yellowed letters and keepsakes, something unexpected caught his eye. It was an envelope, pale lavender, its color faded but unmistakable. His name, Miss Clara Whitmore, was written on it in his own careful handwriting. The letter, the one he'd written half a lifetime ago and never mailed. For a long time he just stared at it, his thumb brushing lightly across the paper, breathing in that faint scent of cedar and dust. Then, with a slow exhale, he opened it. The letter, March 8th, 1974. Dear Clara, I hope this finds you well. I'm writing not because I expect anything to come of it, but because I can't seem to shake a thought that's been with me for a while now, that people ought to say the things they mean while they still have the chance. You probably don't remember, but you once told me that kindness was its own kind of courage. I've thought of that often. In small ways, I've tried to live by it. I just wanted you to know that you made a difference. Not in a big, headline way, but in a way that sticks. You made me believe people could be good again. If ever there's a day you doubt yourself, I hope you'll remember that. Yours, with respect and gratitude, Harold Benton. The words were simple, almost shy, but they hit him with the force of a memory he'd been avoiding for decades. He could see her again, as clearly as if she were sitting across the table. Clara Whitmore, 27, her brown hair tied back, her hands soft but strong. The faint trace of lavender soap she always used. The way she would listen, not just with her ears, but with her eyes, as though nothing in the world mattered more than what you were saying right then. He folded the letter back into its envelope and set it down. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. He had meant to send it. He could even remember sealing it, licking the edge of the envelope, meaning to walk to the post office the next day. But that same week, news came that Clara was engaged to Ray Whitmore, and Harold, being Harold, had quietly decided that his words were no longer needed. A memory in the snow. The snow kept falling that afternoon, the flakes slow and steady, like ash from a quiet fire. Harold put on his old coat and hat, slipped the letter into his inside pocket, and stepped outside. The air bit at his cheeks. The world was hushed. Even the river seemed to flow in silence. He walked to the small park by the bridge, a place where he and Ellen used to sit on summer evenings, long before she got sick. The benches were dusted with snow now, the playground empty. Harold brushed off one bench and sat down. Across the frozen water, the church bell rang 5 times. He listened to the echoes fade. "Clara," he said softly into the air, "you remember that dance at the fire hall?" He smiled at the thought. She'd worn that simple blue dress, the one with the tiny white flowers. He'd been terrified of stepping on her toes. She had laughed when he did, told him, "Don't worry, I've got strong feet." The sound of her laughter echoed in his mind, clear as the bell. He realized that she had been, in her quiet way, his first proof that love didn't have to be dramatic to be real. It could be steady, patient, and kind, like a candle in a window that never quite went out. A visit from Denise. That evening, as Harold returned to his apartment, the building manager, Denise, was decorating the lobby with tinsel and paper snowflakes. "Well, if it isn't our early bird," she said with a grin. "You're out late, Mr. Benton. Thought you turned in by 6 these days." "Trying to stay unpredictable," he replied, with that wry half-smile she liked. She laughed. "Good for you. We're setting up for the holiday party next week. You're coming, right?" "Wouldn't miss it," he said, though he hadn't planned on it before that moment. She pointed to the bundle of envelopes in his hand. "Old letters." "Something like that," he said. "A bit of history, I suppose. Well, hang on to them. The past is the only thing that keeps us from floating away." She winked, and he nodded, thinking she might be wiser than she let on. The candle in the window. That night, Harold placed the lavender envelope on the table by the window. Outside, the street lamps threw golden halos on the snow, and the world looked softer somehow. He lit a candle, not for sadness, but for remembrance, and watched the flame dance. He thought about how life had unfolded, his years with Ellen, their laughter, their quiet rituals, the way she used to hum while baking on Saturday mornings. He thought about the years after she passed, empty at first, then slowly filled again with small acts of purpose. The garden, the letters, the children's laughter at the library. The candlelight flickered on the lavender envelope. Harold whispered, "You made a difference, Clara. You really did." For the first time in a long while, his heart felt lighter, as if he'd finally said what needed saying, even if no one but the winter wind was listening. A gentle decision. Before going to bed, Harold wrote a note to himself on the small pad he kept by the phone. Deliver the lavender letter to the library donation box. He smiled at the thought. The library collected letters and journals each December for a memory exhibit run by the local history society. It was meant to show future generations what life once looked like: handwritten words, real paper, the simple act of reaching out across time. He figured Clara's letter deserved a place there, not as a confession, but as a testament to kindness that had rippled quietly through decades. The morning after. The next morning, Harold woke to sunlight. The snow had stopped, leaving a world so white it seemed almost holy. He made coffee, buttered his toast, and glanced again at the lavender envelope. For a moment, he hesitated, old habits of doubt creeping in. Then he chuckled to himself and said aloud, "No sense keeping it in a drawer forever." He slipped on his coat, tucked the letter in his pocket, and headed out into the bright, crisp air. His steps left clear prints in the snow, each one firm and steady. Down by the river, the sun caught on the ice, making it sparkle like glass. The world was still and beautiful, and for the first time in many years, Harold Benton walked not away from the past, but toward it. Chapter 3: Echoes by the Lake. By mid-December, the snow along the Millersville River had turned to a crust of gray ice, the kind that cracked underfoot but refused to melt. Harold Benton didn't mind the cold much. It gave him an excuse to walk slower, to notice things he might have missed in his younger, hurried days. The curl of chimney smoke from the old houses, the faint tracks of a rabbit near the park fence, the way the river glimmered like pewter under a pale sun. He'd delivered the lavender letter to the library's donation box the week before. Standing there, with his coat dusted in snow and his fingers half frozen, he'd slipped it into the slot with a small, almost ceremonial nod. A letter 40 years late, but perhaps right on time. That quiet act had stayed with him. The world hadn't changed, of course, but he had. It felt like exhaling after holding one's breath for decades. A new routine. Every morning now, Harold walked down to the lakeside path before breakfast. The lake wasn't much, a wide bend of the river with a few benches, a gazebo, and a frozen dock that creaked with age. But it had always been his thinking place. When he was younger, he'd come here after long days at the post office, sitting on the same bench with a thermos of coffee, watching the ducks and listening to the slow lap of water. These days, there were no ducks, only crows and the wind. Still, it felt good to be there, quiet company. One morning, as he rounded the corner by the gazebo, he saw someone sitting on his bench. A woman in a knitted green hat and a plaid coat, sketchbook open in her lap. She was humming softly to herself, something tuneless but pleasant. Harold hesitated, then cleared his throat gently. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She turned, smiling with an openness that caught him off guard. "Not at all. There's plenty of bench for both of us." He nodded and sat down. The cold would bit through his coat, but the company felt unexpectedly warm. "I see you're one of the early walkers too," she said. "Habit from the working days," he replied. "If I sleep past 6, I feel like I've missed a shift." She laughed, a bright, genuine sound. "I know that feeling. I taught 3rd grade for 30 years. My body still thinks the bell rings at 8 sharp." Harold smiled. "A teacher, huh? My respect. I could barely handle my nieces for an afternoon." "June Harper," she said, offering her gloved hand. "Retired, mostly. I do some volunteer tutoring now and then." Harold Benton, former postman, still delivering opinions when asked. She chuckled. "Well, that's a service the world still needs." The lake conversations. Over the next week, they saw each other often, by accident at first, then by quiet agreement. She would bring her sketchbook, he would bring a thermos. They'd sit and talk, sometimes for an hour, sometimes 2. They talked about simple things, old music, favorite diners, the absurd price of coffee these days. But now and then, their words drifted toward the past, the kind of stories that older folks tell not for sympathy, but for the simple act of remembering. June spoke of her husband, Paul, gone 6 years now. "He was a good man," she said, "but never liked sitting still. Even retired, he was always fixing something that wasn't broken." She smiled faintly. "I think the quiet scared him." Harold nodded. Ellen was the opposite. She loved quiet, said it's where you hear the truth of a thing. They fell into silence after that, watching the wind skim across the ice. Finally, June said, "You still talk about her like she's right here." "Some days, she is," Harold said softly. "Other days, it feels like she's a story I once read." The library invitation. The following Thursday, as they parted by the path, June turned to him with a spark in her eye. "You go to the library much, Harold?" "Been known to return a book a year late," he said, grinning. "Well, tomorrow night they're having a reading. Letters and journal excerpts people donated. I'm doing one of the readings. You should come." "Letters?" he asked, startled. "Yes, they're calling it the Voices exhibit. The idea is to share real letters that capture the heart of small-town life. I think you'd like it." He smiled, but his chest tightened. "Maybe I'll stop by." "Do," she said, adjusting her scarf. "And if you sit in the front row, I promise not to quiz you afterward." The reading night. The library's meeting room smelled of coffee, paper, and a faint trace of dust. A comforting scent, Harold thought. Folding chairs were arranged in rows, and a small podium stood at the front, decorated with a pine wreath. He slipped into a seat near the back, feeling oddly nervous. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't his reading, after all. The program began with a local historian explaining the project, how the library had collected letters from residents past and present. Then, one by one, volunteers stepped up to read selections. A soldier's note home from World War II, a mother's letter to her son in college, a thank you from one neighbor to another. And then, June walked to the podium. Her voice, warm and steady, carried easily through the small room. "This next letter," she said, "was written in 1974, but never sent. It was found recently in a donated book of poems. The envelope was lavender, the handwriting careful. The author wrote simply to thank a friend for her kindness." Harold froze. He didn't breathe. She began to read. "You probably don't remember, but you once told me that kindness was its own kind of courage. I've thought of that often. In small ways, I've tried to live by it." Her voice wove through the words he'd written half a lifetime ago. Each line sounded both foreign and familiar, as if they had been waiting all these years to be spoken aloud. When she finished, there was silence, then gentle applause. June looked up from the page, her eyes searching the room. For a brief moment, Harold thought she saw him. Their eyes met. She smiled softly, as if she understood. After the reading, when the crowd dispersed, Harold lingered near the doorway, unsure whether to speak. But June found him first. "You came," she said. "I did," he replied. "You read beautifully." "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "It was your letter, wasn't it?" He blinked. "How'd you know?" "I recognize the way you talk about kindness," she said. "Most people don't say it like that anymore." He chuckled, embarrassed. "I suppose the secret's out." She touched his arm gently. "I think it was a gift, that letter. You reminded a room full of people that gratitude never expires." He looked at her for a long moment. "You make it sound better than it was." She shook her head. "No, Harold. Sometimes the quietest things echo the longest." Evening reflections. That night, Harold walked home under the cold stars. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the air sharp with wood smoke. For the first time in many years, he felt not just content, but alive, as though his life still had chapters yet unwritten. Back in his apartment, he sat by the glowing window, poured himself a cup of tea, and smiled. He thought of Clara, her laughter, her lavender soap, her kindness. And he thought of June, her green hat, her easy laughter, her courage to read someone else's words aloud for the sake of memory. Different women, different times, but maybe the same lesson, that love, even unreturned or unspoken, can ripple forward in ways you never see coming. He lifted his cup toward the window, as if in a quiet toast. "To echoes," he murmured, "and to new beginnings." Chapter 4, Lessons Return. By the time the holidays passed, Millersville had settled into that deep winter quiet when even the sound of footsteps seemed to carry for miles. Snowbanks rose along the sidewalks like soft gray walls, and the river ran half-frozen, whispering under its icy skin. Harold Benton had always thought of January as the month of waiting. Waiting for spring, for letters, for something to happen. But this January felt different. Maybe it was because of that night at the library, or maybe because of June Harper's steady presence in his days. Either way, the waiting didn't feel so heavy anymore. The invitation. It started with a phone call. "Mr. Benton?" came a familiar voice. "This is June, from the lake bench." He chuckled. I'd have recognized the voice even without the hint. "Well," she said, "you've officially been volunteered. The library's short on hands for the after-school reading program. I told them about your perfectly legible handwriting and your intimidating knowledge of stamps." "Oh, you did you? I might have also mentioned that you make a mean thermos of coffee." He laughed. Blackmail through flattery. "You're good. So you'll come?" she asked. He paused, glancing toward the window where the afternoon light slanted across the maple tree's bare limbs. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'll come." The children's hour. The following Thursday, Harold arrived at the library wearing his good sweater, the one Ellen had knitted 20 years ago, navy blue with wooden buttons. June was waiting by the front desk, her green hat slightly askew. "You're early," she said, smiling. "Overachiever. Old mailmen are like that," he said. "We show up before the letters do." She led him into the small reading room, where a handful of children sat cross-legged on a rug covered in cartoon animals. Their laughter filled the space like sunlight. One boy had brought a toy truck. A little girl in a pink sweater was whispering secrets to a stuffed bear. "This," June said, "is our future generation of loud readers." Harold grinned. "Looks promising." June handed him a thin book with a bright red cover. "The Little Mailman of Birch Street." "Coincidence?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Fate," she said. "You're up." He cleared his throat, took a seat, and began to read. His voice, though a little rough at first, soon found its rhythm, slow, steady, and warm. The children leaned in, eyes wide, as he told the story of a mailman who never missed a day, rain or shine, because he knew each letter carried something important. By the time he reached the last page, the kids were grinning and one shouted, "That was good. Do it again." He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that surprised even him. "Maybe next week," he said, a purpose renewed. After the children left, June handed him a cup of cocoa from the library's little vending machine. "You're a natural," she said. "I just read," he said modestly. "Exactly," she replied. "Sometimes that's all people need, someone to read." They sat together at one of the long wooden tables, surrounded by the quiet rustle of books being shelved. Snow drifted past the tall windows. Harold felt the calm settle in his bones, the kind that comes only when a person's exactly where they're meant to be. "You ever think," he said after a while, "how many people go their whole lives not realizing how much small things matter?" June nodded. "All the time. But every once in a while, someone shows up to remind them." He looked at her then, and she smiled that same knowing smile she'd worn by the lake. Something unspoken passed between them. Not romantic, not even sentimental, just human. Two people who had learned that kindness, when offered freely, was enough. The essay. Later that week, June convinced Harold to write something for the library's monthly newsletter. "Just a short piece," she said, "about whatever you like." He protested at first, but one evening he sat down at his kitchen table, pen in hand, and began to write. The words came slower than they once had, but they came. "I used to think love was something you said only when the moment was right. I learned too late that the moment is always right. These days, I find love in smaller shapes, in a child's laughter during story time, in a neighbor's wave, in the sound of the river still moving under the ice." Maybe that's what getting older is, learning that the things that matter were never grand to begin with. H.B. Millersville. He gave the essay to June the next day, cheeks red with embarrassment. "It's just a few words," he said. "Probably not worth printing." She read it once, then again, and looked up with tears shining in her eyes. "Oh, Harold," she said softly, "this is exactly what people need right now. A bit of mischief." In February, the library hosted its annual story fair, a cheerful chaos of kids, books, and cookies. June manned the raffle table while Harold supervised the crafts. The room smelled of glue sticks and cocoa. "Mr. Benton," a small boy asked, "were you really a mailman?" "For 40 years, Harold said proudly. "Did you deliver to Santa?" He chuckled. "Not directly. He's got his own route, I hear." The boy thought for a moment, then whispered, "Can you tell him I was good this year?" Harold leaned closer. "I'll make sure the message gets through." From across the room, June caught his eye and smiled. He lifted his cup of cocoa in salute. She returned the gesture with her own. Later that day, as they packed up, she said, "You looked happy today." "I was," he admitted. "It's strange. I didn't think I'd find new beginnings at 70. June zipped up her coat. "Maybe they find you." The quiet evening. That night, Harold walked home through a light snowfall. The air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. He paused by the frozen river, looking across to the faint lights of the far bank. He thought of all the years he'd delivered letters, each envelope a small hope traveling from one heart to another. He realized he'd spent his whole life carrying messages, but only now, in retirement, had he learned to deliver his own. Back home, he sat by the glowing window and opened his notebook again. He wrote a new letter, not to anyone specific, but to life itself. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for sending new lessons, even when I thought the classroom was closed." He folded the page and placed it in the same poetry book that had once held Clara's letter. Outside, the maple tree branches glimmered under the street lamp. The world was quiet again, but not empty. Somewhere in the stillness, he could hear laughter from the children at the library, June's soft voice reading, and the steady heartbeat of a man learning, once more, how to live. Final chapter, the glow of evening. Spring came slowly to Millersville that year. It crept in like a shy guest, knocking at the door with the scent of wet earth and lilacs. Snowmelt trickled through the gutters, and children's laughter returned to the streets. For the first time in months, the sun felt warm again, not just bright. Harold Benton sat on his porch one morning with a cup of coffee and the newspaper folded beside him. The pages rustled gently in the breeze. Across the yard, the maple tree, his old companion through every season, was budding again. He smiled at it. "You never give up, do you?" he said softly. The tree said nothing, of course, but the rustle of its new leaves felt like an answer, a visit and a gift. By late April, Harold's Thursdays had become routine, mornings at the library, afternoons at the diner with June, and an occasional game of checkers with Walt, his old postal buddy. The children still begged him to read The Little Mailman of Birch Street, and June always laughed when he did the silly voices. One Thursday, as he was packing up, June handed him a small envelope. The paper was pale lavender. "What's this?" he asked, turning it over. "Something you deserve," she said. "Open it later." "Not now." He slipped it into his jacket pocket, intrigued but obedient. That night, at his kitchen table, he carefully opened it. Inside was a note, handwritten in June's tidy script, and a sprig of dried lavender tied with twine. "Harold, you've brought more light to this town, and to me, than you probably realize. I found this lavender years ago pressed in an old book, and somehow it reminded me of your letter from long ago, the one you said you never sent. Maybe this can be your answer, a reminder that love, in any form, never really fades. It just changes its color. Thank you for reminding me that life still surprises us, even in its quiet seasons. June." Harold sat for a long while at the table, reading the words again and again. His throat tightened. It wasn't the kind of love that demanded anything. No promises, no confessions. It was simply shared understanding, deep and steady, the kind that grows between people who have seen enough of life to recognize what truly matters. He placed the lavender in a glass jar on the windowsill. The light from the lamp caught it just so, turning it gold. The last reading. In May, the library held its final children's reading before summer break. Parents came, bringing cookies and folding chairs. The kids were taller now, louder too. Harold had chosen a new book for the occasion, The Boy Who Collected Days, a story about a young boy who saved moments like treasures. When he finished reading, the children clapped, and one little girl ran up to give him a handmade card. On the front, in big, uneven letters, it said, "Thank you, Mr. Benton, for your stories." Inside was a crayon drawing of him and June sitting by a window, sunlight glowing behind them. "Well," he said, blinking a little too fast, "that's going on the fridge." June came up beside him, resting a hand on his arm. "You've built something here," she said quietly. "More than you know." He smiled. "Guess an old mailman can still make a few deliveries." Echoes by the lake, again. Summer arrived with soft evenings and long, golden light. One Sunday, June called and said, "Meet me by the lake." Same bench. When he arrived, she was already there, a picnic basket at her side. The water shimmered like glass, and ducks floated near the reeds. "I brought lemonade," she said, "and something to show you." From the basket, she pulled out the library's new summer newsletter. On the cover was a photograph of the reading room, and right beneath it, his essay from winter, reprinted under the title, "The Window Still Glows." "They picked your piece for the front page," she said. "Everyone loves it." Harold chuckled softly. "Imagine that. My handwriting's famous." They sat in silence for a while, sipping lemonade, watching the sun dip lower over the lake. The air smelled of lilacs and warm grass. "You ever think," June said, "that maybe we're all still learning, even at this age?" "Every day," he said. "Only difference is, now I take better notes." She laughed, that soft, musical laugh he'd come to know. For a moment, everything felt perfectly still, the water, the light, the quiet pulse of evening around them. The letter sent. That night, when he returned home, Harold went to his desk and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. For decades, he'd written letters that were never sent, tucked away in drawers and books. But this one felt different. Not a secret, not a burden. A farewell of sorts, but not to anyone gone. To the man he used to be. "Dear Harold, you did well. You loved, even when it went unanswered. You showed up, even when no one asked you to. And you kept the window glowing, even through long winters. I think that's what love really is. The light we keep for others to find their way home. Yours truly, the man who finally learned it." He folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it on the windowsill beside the jar of lavender. Outside, the maple tree swayed gently in the evening breeze. The light from the window spilled across the yard, warm and steady. The glow of evening. As twilight deepened, Harold made one last cup of coffee and stepped onto his porch. The fireflies were out, tiny lanterns drifting through the yard. Somewhere down the block, a radio played an old Sinatra tune. The best is yet to come. He thought of Ellen, of Clara, of June, of the children at the library, of all the faces that had passed through his life like pages in a book. And he realized something. The love he'd once thought lost had never truly left. It had simply changed shape, softened around the edges, and found new ways to stay. He smiled, lifting his cup in quiet toast to the evening sky. The sun's last light glowed in the windows across the street, one by one, as if the whole town were gently reminding him. The story isn't over. It's simply entering its calm, beautiful chapter. And there, as night settled softly over Millersville, Harold Benton, retired mailman, reluctant writer, unexpected teacher, sat by his glowing window and felt at peace with it all.